This is Martin Carkson, Communication Studies professor at Colorado State University and the founder and director of the CSU Center for Public Deliberation. So this is going to be a video focused on the basic responsibilities of what we call the deliberative facilitator. So this is a key part of our training for our students every semester. But I want to make it available to others, particularly to get feedback and kind of refine these as we're constantly trying to kind of improve and get better ideas in a sense, right? This video is kind of assuming that you've gotten the basics of the CPD and the work that I do in terms of wicked problems and the social psychology and brain science. So I will post a link on the comments to a set of videos that kind of give you the basics. This is literally typically third, fourth day of class when we do an all-day retreat for our student facilitators after they've heard the big picture theory of the work of the CPD and wicked problems and why we need to develop processes that avoid triggering the worst of human nature and tap in the best, right? So assuming these should stand alone somewhat, but it'll make a lot more sense if you're familiar with that work, right? So I'm going to jump to the presentation here, and the slides will also be available on the comments as well. And feel free to interact with me. You got my email. Pretty active on LinkedIn these days of sharing lots of different ideas and giving updates. So you can kind of follow me there as well, right? So the basic idea here, facilitation is part of a broader kind of framework of a key component of deliberative engagement. Again, I cover this a little bit more on the third of the initial kind of slides in a way, but just kind of as a quick review in a sense. All the things that we do in deliberative engagement meetings to spark a much better conversation. And in particular, one of the most important ones is there on the bottom of deliberative facilitators, someone at the table who is trained generally in deliberation and conflict management, and also trained specifically on that topic to help improve the conversation, to elevate the conversation. We specifically talk about the notion of interventions. The hope is that the conversation is between the people at the table and the facilitator is not running the conversation. Guiding might be an okay term to it, but sometimes even that's too strong. They're intervening in the conversation at particular points to improve it. To get kind of what we want out of it as we go through, right? So some of the basics of the theory of facilitation that we have at the CPD, which has developed over the last 20 years or so. So first is that we see facilitation as an art, not a science. And I make this clear to the students from the very beginning, is you're going to be asking us a lot of questions about what should I have done in this situation. And to be honest, we're never going to give them a straight answer. There's never a right answer to how do you respond to something, because there's always just far too many factors involved, whether that's time, whether that's the purpose of that event, whether that's the makeup of the group that you have, whether that's the skill set that you have and the confidence that you have in making that right choice and taking advantage of a deliberative kind of opportunity in a sense, right? So we, in particular, have this notion of self-reflective practice that we borrow from the field of nursing, that we're constantly doing kind of this cycle between three things of providing some content, what this video is, then providing a chance to practice, whether that's in class, whether that's observing an actual event, eventually that's actually, facilitating an event, and then reflecting on that, getting a chance to come back and think through and having a debrief and talking through. So most of our events will prep for the event, we'll have the event, and then we'll have a chance to debrief the event and think through that and dig into specific examples and what would you have done here? What else could you have done, right? So that self-reflective practice is a constant cycle that we try to give our students to build kind of the art of facilitation and the skills, right? The CPD also argues for a rather active facilitator. And this is a change from where we started. I was trained initially primarily as a rather passive facilitator. Assume that the process is going to kind of run itself, that you don't want to distract from the conversation, that you don't want to kind of intervene too often. And we kind of started with that for the first few years. But then we found that the conversations were still pretty flat, right? A lot of our work is to get beyond this one at a time at a microphone, kind of people, a collection of individual opinions of people talking past each other. And without the active facilitator, it was a little bit better because we were in a circle. It was a small group. People were much likely to listen to each other. But there wasn't that much natural interaction. And some problems of groupthink. The first comment was significantly positive, is much more likely that there's a run of positive comments, and to switch it to consider the tensions doesn't happen. People didn't interact very much, particularly when there was conflict. Most people avoid conflict, right? So when there was disagreement, people either kind of stayed quiet or didn't kind of explore it. So the more and more we did this work, the more we realized we're going to have to be a more active facilitator. We're going to have to train our students to intervene a little bit more to really get the kind of conversation we need. That being said, we recognize there's trade-offs there, right? We recognize, and you'll see this within the 10 responsibilities, that facilitator can do too much, and concerns about impartiality and fairness crop up the more active you are. So that is going to be an inherent tension that we'll talk about throughout this video. And then lastly, these 10 responsibilities I developed initially from, my initial training. Most workbooks have, here, a good facilitator does these, or a moderator accomplishes these. So I kind of borrowed from some of those, and then we actually I did a whole survey of a lot of facilitators and went back and forth. I've got quite a big report I did for Kettering Foundation if people want to kind of dig into the weeds on this, and then settle with these 10. But a key aspect of these 10 is the recognition that these 10 don't fit together very well. That it's pretty much impossible to fulfill all 10 responsibilities because several of these responsibilities are in tension with each other, and doing one makes it a lot harder to do another. Right. So this becomes the overall theory of facilitation that we have, that a good facilitator is constantly working to balance these responsibilities and making some tough choices about which to prioritize in a specific time. And then as we get into later in the semester, into the specific tools and moves and types of questions, we all kind of come back to these responsibilities in a sense of, your question is designed in a way to help fulfill a responsibility. Recognizing it's also probably undermining other responsibilities. So again, you're making those choices, and you'll see that as you kind of go through, right? So we got 10 responsibilities. Each of this is from 3 pages in our workbook. So I'm going to give you all the text. I'm not going to read all this text. If you're interested, you might want to pause and kind of just read the quick paragraph as you go through, right? But I'm going to kind of give an overview of each of these 10. So first, remains impartial about the subject of the forum. This is, a key aspect of deliberative facilitation. Impartiality, neutrality, objective, lots of words for it. I'll post something on the message board of an article I wrote about principled impartiality in times of hyperpartisanship. Yes, we see ourselves as an impartial organization. Our facilitators are trained to be impartial. But we recognize, hopefully, a lot of nuance in that, right? And we recognize that overemphasizing neutrality can be a problem. And we also recognize that being purely neutral is kind of easy if you never say anything, right? As soon as you ask a question, as soon as you intervene, as soon as you make some moves, by definition, in a way, they're not purely impartial, right? So part of our impartiality, we see it in terms of principled impartiality, right? That we're committed to good information, we're committed to democracy, but we're also committed to impartiality. That's the triangle of principled impartiality that there's another video on if you want to dig into more. It's also professional in the sense of, it's not that individually we are impartial, it's our professional role is to be impartial. And then that leads to pragmatism and the notion that the reason we're impartial is because we believe that leads to good things, right? That communities need impartial resources. We need these bridging institutions to help us have the kind of conversations and engagement that we need. So we're playing that role. So that's the case for impartiality. But from the get-go here, trying to focus on this responsibility basically makes the other 9 responsibilities really hard. All right, so we're going to be constantly violating responsibility 1 for the sake of other responsibilities. The question is doing it in a way that hopefully, has that right balance and has the payoffs that we need. Second is to allow the participants to own the process and topic as much as possible, balancing that need with the deliberative goals of the event. So I added this responsibility. I didn't see it in many other places. Part of it is my ode to my initial training of being a minimalist facilitator. And recognizing that, people left their house, they invested the time and the effort to get to an event, to have this discussion. We want to give them for sure a chance to talk about it, to talk about why they were there. Almost every CPD event starts with going around the table and say, hey, introduce yourself and why are you here? Why is this issue important to you? So right off the bat, they get a chance to kind of express that. We always want to start with more open-ended questions because we want, we don't want to direct people into too much of a box, right? I love Lori Britt from James Madison's kind of conception of deliberative frameworks and processes are kind of a center without a box, right? We are focusing on something, we're foregrounding something, but the barriers are malleable in a sense, right? We'll get that into that a little bit more with another responsibility. But the idea here is we want people to come and talk about what they want to talk about. While, as we see later on, we also want them to talk in a certain way about that. We want to elevate the conversation. So we can't, again, there's a danger, as with all of these, of overemphasizing this a little too much, right? If we just let people have the conversation they want, we get the bad conversations we tend to get about complex issues. But we wanted to establish this as, yeah, this is something we do want to do, and we have to be part of the decision-making process of facilitators. Third, keeps the deliberation on track in terms of time and subject matter. With all of these, again, you'll see the kind of back and forth negotiation. A big part of facilitator is keeping the time, trying to kind of keep people on task, on the focus. But that question of what is on task or not, we don't want to be too strict with, right? We don't want to make, again, too much of a box that we're kind of sticking people into. One of the hardest things that we tell the facilitators is when someone's telling an interesting story and it's taking a while, right? Is it going to land? Is it going to reconnect to the subject, right? And to what degree might you need to kind of intervene to kind of nudge for it to land or to kind of bring out the concept there? The reality is sometimes that tangent can be incredibly useful, can open up space, can help people think about things in different ways. And then sometimes that tangent could just be a time waster that took a lot of time letting one person kind of speak and not necessarily have the payoff. The difficulty is we have no idea which one of those paths it is at the beginning of the story, right? And when we kind of jump in. So yes, generally deliberative processes, one of the key components you saw earlier is a facilitation guide. These are processes that are sometimes designed to the minute. So we do need to keep on time and on track. But especially early on in a project, we also want things, we don't want to assume we got it all figured out, right? So we want people to push back on the discussion guide, people to reframe things, for people to bring things that aren't there. So you're trying to find that balance in a sense. But keeping a time, the time is your friend, as we tell the facilitators, especially to deal with people that are dominating or talking too much, right? Keeping track, making sure that you're getting through the process. CBD, we actually pretty strictly always want to end on time. So we are kind of going to be tough on time to honor people and kind of go through. So playing that timekeeper, giving people time checks, letting them know, okay, we've got about 4 or 5 minutes here before we need to move on. And those type of things becoming a key important part of what a facilitator is doing. Right? Fourth, manages the group well and encourages everyone to join the conversation and ensure no one dominates. This is a basic kind of facilitation thing, which can be difficult. That you're managing the table here. Yeah, you're wanting. We're not aiming for everyone speaks the exact amount of time because it depends on their personality and extroverts and introverts and their interest in the topic. But we certainly want to everyone that wants to speak gets a chance to speak. Right. And if people are dominating, how do we kind of make space for other people? How do we make sure that everyone gets that opportunity? So a lot of that is reading nonverbals. A lot of that is kind of head on a swivel, kind of looking at other people, which can be tough because the next responsibility is you're modeling democratic behavior. You're modeling really good listening skills, which tend to mean good eye contact. But at the same time, you're trying to get a sense of everyone else and who might be next and how people are reacting. So you're trying to find the right balance there. One key thing I'll just throw out here, one of the bigger questions, again, from new facilitators is, how do I deal with the dominators? The overall philosophy that we have is the best way to kind of deal with a dominator is to get other people speaking, right? So not focus so much on getting them to stop speaking, but getting other people redirecting the conversation. Interventions like maybe we can hear from someone we haven't heard from yet, right? Or asking a reaction question and to step in and say, okay, so I'm hearing a couple things from you, this and this. What do other people think about that, right? So you're redirecting the conversation. And sometimes you can use time to help you with that, right? We only got a couple minutes left, and I want to make sure we hear from everybody, right? So let's do some quick hitters, or so these are the interventions we teach to try to kind of balance these. But we want never force anyone to speak. We tend to never call on people. Julie, you haven't spoken yet, right? Unless there's some nonverbal there that seems, Julie, it seems like you're trying to get in here. But But generally, how do we kind of make sure everyone who wants to speak, we lower that bar as much as possible? We use Kaner model here in the Facilitator's Guide to Participatory Decision Making with this notion that how many great ideas were never heard because someone didn't feel comfortable speaking, or they didn't get a chance to speak, or they started to speak and they got shot down pretty quickly. These are all the role of the facilitator to make sure people feel comfortable speaking, to make that space for them, to help them through paraphrasing if necessary, to kind of get their idea out, to ask them good questions, to encourage them. So all the good ideas get out, not just the ideas from people that are confident enough to believe in their own ideas. Right. So here's 5 models encourages democratic attitudes and skills. This is particularly listening, particularly asking good questions. We want, part of every deliberative process is to train people on how to have better conversations on their own, right? Part of the joke of the CPD is this notion that our goal is to make ourselves irrelevant, right? To build the skills in our community to an extent that people can have these conversations without our help. Right? Likely not to happen anytime soon because, again, humans are not wired for these tough kind of conversations. They need help. But one of the most wonderful things about our meetings and the stories that I hear from my students over the last 20 years is how quickly people can pick these up. The sad reality of how infrequently we're provided examples of quality discussion in popular culture and in our political system in a way. And when we give people a chance to be part of an authentic, genuine, respectful conversation, how much they enjoy that and they see that and they follow and they learn these skills. So we see it all the time in a 2-hour event that the first third, the facilitator is very active, and the second third a little bit less active, and then sometimes by the last third, people are asking each other questions. They're listening. They're repeating the specific phrase the student might have said at the beginning of the talk. Hey, tell me a little bit more about that. Why is that important to you? Can you help me understand why? If someone disagrees with you, what would be important to them? These key questions that we'll mention later in the responsibilities. They're asking them, right, rather than the facilitator. So this is the active facilitator that we talk about, is to intervene to elevate the conversation. If the conversation's elevated by the participants, then the facilitator can be the minimalist facilitator and kind of drop back a little bit. 6th, this is probably the hardest one. So this does not take an expert role with a subject matter. And trying to find this kind of tension of what's the role of facts, what's the role of expertise, what's the role of good information. We are biased towards good information. Part of the principle of impartiality is this notion that if it's a choice between good information and clear misinformation, disinformation, we're on the side of good information. But we also recognize the difficulty of drawing that line, particularly on the fly during a synchronous kind of event, right? So one of the big successes of the CPD has been that these students are great kind of resources for principled impartiality, right? Their job is to learn how to become an expert on the process, not an expert on every topic. We'll provide them a lot of information about topics. We'll provide them a glossary. We might spend, for more complex topics, we might spend 2 or 3 days in class and have some significant reading for them to understand broadly the topic so they can do a good job of leading the discussion, but they're not the expert. We often have experts in the room. The leadership of the CPD, whoever's running that project, has somewhat become an expert on the topic as we design the process, design the materials. We're always in the room to be able to come over. So there's different kind of ways of dealing with that. We're also constantly, deliberation is a constant process of, bouncing back and forth between kind of the public voice and the expert voice. And that's before events, during events, and after events. The during event, where the facilitators are most relevant, is probably the hardest of how to deal with these tensions. So one of the strategies we use is when there's something you think is wrong, that you think is kind of bad information, whether you're calling it out then, whether you're opening up space to push back on it, or whether you kind of bracket it and deal with it later, or whether you capture it kind of on your own in the notes for checking after. Those are all viable options, and it depends on lots of different factors, right? We know that if the facilitator becomes a primary fact checker and corrects people, that changes their role. They're no longer a facilitator, they're an expert, and that can be problematic. Right. So we talk a lot. I'm not going to get into all the different kind of tactics here, but there are lots of different kind of interventions we make to try to kind of deal with this. So it's not that we don't care about facts, but it's also that, not that we're overly focused on facts and we're this gatekeeper of good information. We're trying to find the right balance here as we kind of walk through different issues. And a lot of this is, what can we do before the event to prepare for this? How can we anticipate misinformation that might be shared? What are the assumptions that are out there in public discourse that we can be prepared for? Almost all our events, we have an RSVP beforehand that we ask them open-ended questions so we can get a sense before people walk in what they're thinking. And if we see clearly incorrect information on more objective, factual kind of concepts, we can work that into the discussion guide. We can work that into the introduction. A facilitator correcting someone because something was already said or something that is in the documents at the table is a very different thing than the facilitator, because of their own memory or intelligence or expertise, is correcting the facilitator. I mean, correcting the participant, right? So those are some of the things that we think about here. Now we get into a series of 3 that are really the heart of deliberative facilitation, right? Up to now, maybe the expert one is kind of on the fence a little bit, but the 3, 4, and 5 are basic facilitator responsibilities for any kind of facilitation experience. The deliberative facilitator and the way we talk about that is a little bit different, because normally a facilitator is hired by an organization to help them achieve a goal. And the actual meaning of the word facilitate, to make easy, is the client is saying, we want to get to A to B, and the facilitator designs the process. How do we get to B? A deliberative facilitator has a little bit of a different role. Yes, they've been hired to run something, but I also believe that the deliberative facilitator has an allegiance to the community overall, an allegiance to democracy. So they've got some split thing. They're working with that group, but they're also utilizing that group to represent the community and to have broader conversations. So again, there's lots of kind of tensions here. So the deliberative facilitator is trying to constantly balance. Their goal is not just to give people a good time or not just kind of capture their thoughts. Their goal is to spark a good conversation that helps us as a community address our shared problems better. So these are some broader kind of, these are the advanced goals. These are things that we'll be constantly working through in our program. We have the students for at least a year, often 3 or 4 or 5 semesters. These are the ones that after a couple of semesters, they start really kind of getting better at. These are the skills that in particularly we need to refine a little bit more. The most basic facilitation books don't kind of get into this as much. This brings in a lot more conflict management and kind of deliberative theory into facilitation. So again, the 7, 8, 9 are kind of progressive as they go through. So first is helps participants identify the values and underlying interests that motivate their perspectives. And this is the idea that a big part of deliberative facilitation, particularly from the wicked problems lens that we focus on the CPD, is to bring out those underlying values. People tend not to explicitly talk about their values. They're making positions, they're expressing goals, they're expressing concerns, they're defining problems. All those things inherently involve values, whether they're reaching for values, supporting values, or they're calling out a current situation because of a negative impact on values that they hold. So the job of the facilitator, very much also the job of the deliberative practitioner before the event, as we're engaging the noise and engaging the public discourse, is to bring out these underlying values, identify the reasonable things that people care about, identify them and put them on the table and recognize them. To get away from the basic human nature to assume that I've got good values and the people that disagree with me are against those values. Our brains love to define those we disagree with by what they're against, rather than actually listening and asking questions to figure out what they're for. So the facilitator helps the group do this sort of thinking, right? Sometimes that's through a paraphrase, as people have a strong opinion that you're bringing. Okay, so it sounds like safety is particularly important to you. Sounds like you have a concern about privacy. So it feels like you really see the importance of focusing more on the future and kind of what kind of world we're going to leave for our children. Those type of things of bringing out, reframing them. So again, reasonable people care about these things. That's the heart of the wicked problems perspective, is we're shifting from the easy assumption that problems are caused by wicked people with bad values, and putting the wickedness in the problem, which is most problems inherently involve multiple underlying values that don't fit together very well. that require us to have some tough conversations and trying to find ways of dealing with these tensions. So learning how to bring out those values and understand those, of asking questions like, help me understand, why is this so important to you, right? Um, what are the concerns that you have that led to this position, right? Why do you feel so passionate about this problem? Those kind of questions kind of bring out these underlying values. And then sometimes, the move is for the facilitator, through paraphrasing, to explicitly mention that value, right? Then the next step here is helps participants develop mutual understanding, consider a broad range of views, particularly the drawbacks of their perspective and the benefits of opposing views. Again, feel free to pause if you kind of want to read the details here. But for this one, I have a graphic that I've been playing with lately. And this goes back again to the social psychology, that our brains are wired to think cat corners, right? That we really like to focus on the upside of our perspective and the downside of their perspective. That's why we're so sure that we're right and they're idiots, right? And of course, they think the opposite, right? So this is where most public discussions, everyone's kind of talking past each other. The one time in the microphone, people are just kind of talking past. They're not listening to each other. Our brains are wired to do this. So this is kind of either or thinking. We just kind of see two positions, and our brain, again, focuses on the blue. I've been playing lately with this idea of two-party thinking, which is either or thinking kind of on steroids, because all the incentives are really to do this, right? So not only do our brains naturally do this, but then in a two-party zero-sum election kind of system, right, you're primarily just preaching to your own choir. So you're really incentivized and you're rewarded for focusing on the upside of your perspective and the downside of their perspective. Even worse, because of a negativity bias, because of how with wicked problems is there's no magic bullets. It's really hard to kind of clearly come up with a solution or an idea that solves a problem and doesn't have downside. It's always been much easier to criticize the other side versus make your own argument. And once again, our political system tends to reward that kind of behavior, right? So not only does it reward either or thinking, it actually rewards primarily staying on the bottom, right? Primarily negative ads, focusing on the downside of the other side's perspective. So we have both sides talking about how bad the other side is, which not only just it undermines our ability to think of the positive impacts of any institutions, right? I heard the metaphor lately of like what would happen if the airline industry kind of did ads like political ads, right? That just constantly focus on how bad your competitors are, showing plane crashes and maintenance kind of problems and so forth, right? No one would ever want to fly again, right? So we're trying to get away from, for sure, the two-party thinking, and then the problematic aspects of either or thinking, to get to both and thinking. But as you'll see kind of with the next responsibility, both and is not just, oh, we need balance. We need both, right? It's a much more nuanced of, yeah, we need both, but how much of each? How do we kind of dig into that, right? So to kind of go back to this, right? A big part of a deliberative facilitation is to help people fill in their blind spots, right? Help them see reasonable people can hold the opposing perspective. And I should obviously say deliberation is rarely two sides, right? A lot of it is to get away from Democrat, Republican, progressive, conservative thinking and think of multiple things, right? So easier here to kind of just show to generally deliberation is going to have multiple opinions, right? But the main idea is to help people see the downsides of their perspective and the upside of other perspectives, right? To retrain their brain to, instead of assuming the best of their side and the worst of opposing sides, to kind of recognize that. And this isn't to say all opinions are just as good as everyone else's. No, we want the nuance of really struggling with these tough choices. We don't assume when people do this, when they fill in their blind spots, that they're going to completely change their mind. They're certainly very likely to continue to believe their perspective is the best. But they'll do it in a much more nuanced way of understanding that their perspective isn't perfect and that reasonable people, that the other perspectives have some pretty good stuff, right? Their belief and their perspective is based on this notion of the ratio of upside to downside of my perspective needs to be better than the ratio of other perspectives. Our brains want simple. Our brains want certainty. Our brains want 100% I'm right and 100% they're wrong. That's rarely ever the case, right? So admitting to, yes, mine isn't perfect. Yes, here are some trade-offs. Yes, here are some costs. Yes, here are some values my perspective really supports, and here's some values that probably doesn't do so well on, right? That's a big part of this deliberative process. That's really hard to do in a two-party system and in a two-party incentive system, right? Because admitting your downside is a sign of weakness. Admitting the upside is giving them fodder, right? So when the system rewards two-party system, that's really problematic. A deliberative process redoes those incentives and hopefully kind of undermines the incentives of just a simplistic kind of two-party kind of either or thinking in a way, right? The last thing to say here, and this gets into polarity management, which there's another video, so I won't spend too much time here, but part of the magic of a deliberative system is if we do a good job of this, if at our table we help people see the downside of their perspective and the upside of opposing perspectives, we often actually start seeing a lot of common ground, right? The key common ground here is we recognize the stuff on the top is good and the stuff on the bottom is bad. And we shift from the focus being us against them to how do we work together to stay on the top and avoid the bottom as much as possible. Now, I still might see the top left being much better than the top right and be more concerned about the bottom right than the bottom left. So we're not going to agree completely, but then we're actually going to find out that we have a lot more in common. A big part of deliberation is to redefine the conflict from this exaggerated conflict that we have that's often incentivized and polarized to the actual conflict. And the actual conflict is always much more manageable because we actually agree on a lot. There's a lot of stuff on the top we agree on. There's a lot of stuff on the bottom that we agree on. And if we undo the negative incentives just to win and create kind of, hey, collaboration works. How do we work together to stay on the top and avoid the bottom? Is the key part that we're doing. So to do that, facilitators have to help people push back. When people have a strong opinion, asking questions like, so people that disagree with you, what do you think is important to them, right? If we do what you want us to do, are there any trade-offs? Are there any concerns, unintended consequences we might come? If you think about your perspective, what values do you think it really kind of fits in well? And what values do you think it might kind of struggle with a little bit, right? These kind of questions help people, reaction questions that we'll get into later. Okay, strong opinion here. Let's hear from that. What do y'all like about this? What do y'all not like about this, right? Bring out those underlying things. If everyone's attacking a position, if everyone hates an idea, right? To shift and say, hey, people that like this idea, why do you think it's allow people to kind of see the upside of positions or try to make the case for the upside of the positions they disagree with, right? And that starts filling out the full map here. So we actually have the conversation we need to have. A lot of this is undoing the basic processes of social psychology and brain science and our political system and our media system that rewards this. How do we undo it, right? Ninth, the big payoff is once you do that, then the most advanced deliberative process is to help participants identify and work through their key tensions within and between their perspectives. So once you do this, now you're seeing the tension. You're shifting from that horizontal tension to the vertical, right? And how do we kind of work together? How do I get the upside I want, but mitigate or avoid the downside as much as possible, right? How do I get them what they want while also kind of avoiding that? And hopefully, with the full framework, this is a much more collaborative kind of decision-making versus either or kind of win-win, right? So identifying those tensions, this is something we can do before an event. We can prep our students often saying, hey, here are some of the big tensions we identified. A lot of my work on polarity management is always looking at these kind of key tensions that are undermining so many of the different topics that we have that tend not to be discussed naturally. Again, in a two-party system, you don't want to have to talk about tensions, right? The tension is us versus them. It's a false tension. So better understanding these underlying tensions, bringing them out, sometimes explicitly, sometimes naturally through the process is a key aspect of what we're working on every single issue. And again, I'll post a link to polarity management that highlights a lot of the inherent tensions to most issues if you want to dig into more of this, right? And the last one is this notion that a facilitator with polarity management, even going back to Aristotle's notion of the ideal mean, there's this a perspective that we're trying to stay away from the extremes, right? That we're trying to push people into the middle, not the middle in terms of the exact middle. The middle might be more to one side or the other depending on the specific situation. Right? But the skills that we try to teach a deliberative facilitator is, yes, in some ways we're always aiming for the perfect middle, but that's kind of really hard target. The skill set is more, how do you get away from the extremes when you know your group has gone too far? So you see some in particular here between idealism and realism, complexity and simplicity, depth versus breadth, right? If the group is way in the weeds, how do you kind of get them back up to kind of big picture kind of thinking, right? If they're just incredibly negative, right? How do you get them to be a little bit more optimistic? How do you ask some kind of future questions like, hey, in 10 years this worked. What happened, right? If it's too positive, how much you kind of get them back to the real world in a sense. And depth versus breadth, right? Like, are you wanting to really focus on the specific actions, or you wanting kind of big picture? One way CPD events negotiates this is, we often have 10 tables going, right? So we might have a lot of depth at individual tables, but breadth across them. So we kind of train students how much time do you spend? If you've got 5 ideas to look at, we're not saying spend equal time on all 5. You might not be able to do that. Might be too much breadth, right? So, but if each table does a good 2 or 3, probably across the tables, we're getting a lot of both depth and breadth, right? So those skills to kind of push back, right? So these are the 10 responsibilities all kind of put together. Again, the basic idea is that there's natural tensions. All 2 through 10 are in tension with 1, 3 through 10 are in tension with 2, and then others of how much time is the facilitator speaking, how active are they. The last kind of point I'll make is we believe from a facilitation perspective in our experience that give me 10 minutes with a facilitator, give the training staff 10 minutes. We can get to the point that they're skilled enough to make a positive impact on a conversation. Just having someone whose role it is to play a facilitator and some basic kind of moves to do that helps, right? So the bar of a facilitator making a positive impact is really low. Being a great facilitator is really, really hard, right? Because it's a constant process. Again, you're wearing so many different hats, finding the right balance, knowing in a specific situation which responsibility should take priority, and then having the skill set and the confidence and the time to be able to actually fulfill that responsibility. But this is the framework. We, again, start with this on the 3rd day of class, and then the rest of their time, we're constantly coming back to these, giving them skills on how to do it, and giving them knowledge and hopefully wisdom to make the choices between these as much as possible, right? So with that, I thank you for your time. And feel free to kind of ask questions on the comment or shoot me emails. I potentially might do deeper dives into any of these responsibilities if there's particular interest. Thank you.